Welcome to Analyzing for Workflow Reduction, from many to one to zero. I'm Philip Bloom. I'm an engineering manager at Machine Zone. I've been doing build systems and game tools for a little more than a decade now, working on systems from the Xbox 360 to Android. Worked on a number of the Tomb Raider games, but have recently been doing mobile phone development, such as Final Fantasy: A New Empire, Mobile Strike. Today we're going to be going over to an approach for looking at workflows and processes. Ideally, most of the stuff we're going to be looking at is simple tool examples, things that you could build in a week, types of problems that you could solve by both internal and off-the-shelf solutions. The main purpose of it is to try and drive into some of the practical applications and use cases, things that you can look for in your own tools. The intent ideally is that there's something you can take away to improve your own internal tools, no matter what they happen to be. So let's get started with the ideal game tool. Something that could make the ultimate game, preparing it, optimizing it, launching it smoothly on all platforms at the same time. Something that just reads my mind and gets what I want to do outwards. We build it and we're done. We can stop. Well, this isn't possible, but the concept of looking at our workflows and processes until they're as simple as go can constantly be applied within the space and the processes that people work, the user interfaces, and the tools themselves. So how do we get there? How do we start approaching from we have a very complicated process to how do we get to a simple one? First, the important thing is to look at the workflows that exist, good and bad, and there are many steps. We got to understand qualitatively what the workflow going on today is. How are people getting their work done? Any workflow that you're looking at will probably have many parts, whether it's steps that people are going through, communications between different groups. And the most important thing to try and drive at is the questions that that workflow is answering for the business and for the people. Who needs to be involved in this workflow? Why does that workflow exist? What is it solving for folks? Usually when you're driving, you're going to find several layers of whys that are being answered by the workflow. It's important to sort of understand them before you start looking at optimizing or improving upon it. So how do we approach this? How do we get this into something sort of actionable? Usually, I like to start with getting a diagram of what's going on right now. I'm going to be doing a visual one here for the presentation, but it doesn't have to be fancy. Often a shared whiteboard or a Google Doc or a spreadsheet is an excellent place to get started. The main thing is providing an open space to review problems and add areas that are missed in our understanding of what's going on. Here we got a simple example of preparing a mobile game release. We got to create a code branch, we have to make a data branch, we got to build some binaries, we got to get those binaries over to QA. We have to iterate the developers in QA to get the product polished. And then we have to send that out to customers. It's very high level, but if you were to drive into any of these steps, you'd find that there's a lot of questions and a lot of things going on. Say if we were to just talk about the creating of a data branch, we might care where we're creating that data branch from. Can we repeat it if we need to do in like 3 or 6 months? Are we able to iterate on it over the course of preparing the product? Are we able to get stuff out there? When bugs are reported, are we able to get fixes out to it in a reasonable fashion? Say if we're talking from the QA perspective, for the product, they might need to know, hey, is stuff ready to test? What parts are important? If there's many products going on or many areas, where should they be focusing their effort? How do they get this stuff to their development environment so that they can test it and look into it? How do they know that things are set up correctly so that they're not worrying it and they know that they have valid feedback to get back to the developer tools? Sometimes as you go, you might find that you get a really enormous list of here's the questions going on. So you can also group things up and sort of see if you can try and divide and conquer. Maybe working on stuff to improve the branching state of affairs can individually be simplified, and then you can come back to the bigger picture. It can be looking at where the value is most added for your time within the workspace. When you're looking at it also, it's not very uncommon to find, hey, we could do this, but there's a big problem, and if only I find to be a really interesting question. It's often where people are stepping outside of the box of like, this is what's going on and where they can solve, and finding new things that we could solve by building new tools, research, or buying new solutions. Looking over it as a whole, it's important to also figure out sort of what's the big why that this process is going on? Why do we have all these steps going there? Well, for this one, the product team would like to get their next game safely to customers. It's a high-level why, but when we're digging into the individual steps, we can see whether those steps are really in support of this why, or the whys that those steps are producing in support of it or not. And that can help us get a better idea of what we're going to be reducing out. So we have a diagram, and we understand why the process exists and what it's most importantly serving. So we're ready to solve it. We can just head over to our desk and don't do this. Don't hide at your desk thinking you have the overall problem space understood. Game development is a team affair. Share your findings. Other points of view are critical to making sure there's a well-understood view of what we're doing and what we're trying to solve. They may have details that we missed in our initial information gathering, or just different approaches on how to reduce things. Even when this doesn't come to a successful situation of delivering a new product or a new workflow for the end users, it can still be helpful. It can identify other areas of investment or bring folks onto the same page about things that are too expensive for us to make a different solution for within this development cycle. We may choose other options based on the whole business having a good understanding of what we're going about. So when we drive to this, though, how far can we go? One of the things I like to talk with my teams about is doing things in one step. This tends to build on a qualitative understanding of the workflows. You really have to have a good, deep grasp of what are they really needing to accomplish and what is the important things to them. Try and take from that to derive the simplest solution to get them towards that. At the end of the day, it's really about trying to enable intent to action. The end users have decided the developers want to accomplish X, and they're able to just go about accomplishing it. They're not having to set up a bunch of minutia and hook a bunch of parts into place in order to get there. One of the things I would sort of picture it as is like, hey, if I wanted to go take a trip, I don't go ahead and I look up prices, check what planes are available, pack my bags, drive out there. I can go ahead and I'm there. I'm in Hawaii. I'm relaxing on the beach. If we can try and drive for our tools to give that kind of simple experience of, I'd like to accomplish something, I don't have to set up a bunch of minutia, I just go, then we're enabling folks to stay in the flow of development a lot lower. Now, just because this is one step doesn't mean it has to be a single tool. For releasing a new build, as we were using as an example, a single workflow could cascade through many tools as a pipeline, leveraging them to accomplish parts of the flow without having to be a monolithic, do this. We could have a developer at their desk trigger a release tool, which itself could go out to your CI systems and build out and run tests and run verifications and make sure stuff is ready. And then that could go to an app distribution tool to package it and send it out to all of the QA folks at your multiple sites. And you could use that as well with the messaging tool to go notify them, hey, this build for this game is ready and you should start testing it around this time. And so it doesn't all have to be one big overarching setup. You can, in fact, improve it partially over time and just be looking at how can things connect to each other to deliver. I'm just having to think about one thing, and all of the other things that I would want to accomplish are thought about in turn. So we're going to go into a workflow example of reducing something. This is going to be a particularly poor workflow we're going to walk through here, but also it's a problem area in general I don't think for game development anyone should really ever be thinking about. Just for a little bit of background on the space, when you're working on iPhones, you have to deal with iOS provisioning. It's a method where folks are using certificates, a portal, and provisioning profiles to indicate, hey, for this user holding this device with this application, they have a right to run it on their phone. And they also have a right to go ahead and access these services, such as in-app purchases or various other things that Apple is providing for their end users. It has a lot of problems. There's been a lot of good improvements on it in the years, a lot of things that they've tried to automate to make it so that small teams can quickly get going. But it still doesn't very much scale well to large development, multi-site development, things that run in their lifetime of several years rather than a few weeks. So we'll come back to some of the practical concerns with iOS provisioning in a moment, but like what kind of workflow was going on some years back at MZ? We had that a developer would be at their desk and they'd open up their Xcode project and stuff wouldn't work. They'd be trying to run to device and things, they would just not be able to run, and provisioning would be their problem. So they didn't understand how it worked because it was something that you have to dig into a little bit. So they would go over to IT, who also didn't understand how it worked, and they would go and have it, but they had a USB stick that had the right solution. And they'd walk over to the person's desk and plug in the USB stick, and it would go ahead actually and log into the Apple portal and go and run a bunch of things for them to create a new certificate and provisioning profile. And then they'd be happy and working again, and folks could step off. And the person somewhere right next to them would suddenly stop working because actually the USB stick was holding the same account for everyone at the company, and it would not, each person would knock each other over in turn. It's a pretty embarrassing bit, but I think it's also important when we're looking at what we can reduce in our own companies. Every company that I've worked at has had some embarrassing things that go on in how they deliver game products. And looking there and taking an open view of them is a good way into where we find, hey, this is where we're wasting energy, we're wasting time, and we're just struggling through it because it's there. So besides sort of the obvious of that thing, there is a lot of challenges with provisioning. If you're working on many different game products, you may prototype stuff and test it out in the market. So you may have different portals that the teams need to deal with in different game products. Their certificates are only good for 1 to 2 years at most. And so you need to deal with the fact that products will just expire and stop working. You may have many different teams at many different sites, and they all need to stay up and working at the same time. And you may have different use cases. QA, what they need to do is different from what the C++ coders might need to do, which is different from what some of the localization folks might need to do, which is different from the sales folks. So we need to take care of all of these things and make sure that, hey, as we deal with the builds over time, they just continue to work. So how did we fix this? If we were doing this today, I'd probably recommend Fastlane as an off-the-shelf solution. We just built something in-house for ourselves, which was called Setup Developer. We went on the focus of saying, looked over the group of the overall experience and said, hey, we can actually group almost everyone together under the holistic use case of just being ready to do the most complicated stuff. So how do we set people up for that most complicated state? Well, let's make sure that the second they get stuff straight from Git, it's ready to go. So we'll adjust the make files. And for all the certificates, provisioning profiles, and keys, they may need to do development work. We can just build one tool that self-installs all of them for it because it really doesn't matter to the developer which product they are on in the course of our company. So for them, this suddenly changed from, here's this process. I don't know, there's a lot of complexity I need to deal with, to, hey, I just click this button once and I don't have to worry about it for a year or more. I have all my certificates, I have all my profiles, and when I open up my Xcode project, things just work. So what are some of the things that we help drive towards making tools or workflow adjustments like this? First, we broke things into groups. We looked at, hey, what's the overall state? And we actually found, hey, we could do a no special snowflake solution. I'm really big on those, seeing how we can smooth over the complex differences between an overall group and give them something that just works across the board. So that instead of saying, hey, these small details require us to be very complicated and ask you a lot of questions, we can instead say, we're going to handle this for the best of cases, and that should cover for all of them. Sometimes that's not doable. So you can still, though, break folks into groups. Sometimes for an artist, maybe they're coming through Maya. So from that entry point, you have more context, and you can realize that the tool should do certain things for them based on where they're launching it from. This can help avoid questions. I'm a big fan of reducing your mandatory questions for folks. Every question's a step. If to run your tool, I have to open and go through a dozen checkboxes to say, I need it to look like this, and to click on this, and to have it this level, then you're asking a lot of questions and you're keeping them out of staying in the flow. Allow saving of options. Sometimes, like, I've worked at places that had really robust configuration systems. So when they needed to do new products and they needed to all their tools to act in a different way, they could just change it at the low-level configuration. Sometimes when you have a lot of options, letting folks save it, yes, hey, they have to have a lot of questions once. And then after that point, everything's selected on the way that they wanted to, and they can just run it from there. Sometimes if you allow them to save those as templates, they can share that with one another and be, hey, I'm working on this design tool. I want to be making an object like this. I can just grab our object off the top. A big thing to do is to see where you can group between meaningful communication boundaries. Hey, we had to have IT and a developer talk on this originally, but IT wasn't really adding anything to the general process. They were just there because they were part of the workflow that existed, but they didn't need to be. And so we could optimize to say, how are we having them not include it in the final result of this? Sometimes, hey, processes are actually so that individuals can just talk, in which case we can look and say, how can we simplify so that developers can go just directly to talking and they're not having to go through a number of setup steps before discussing their work. One of the things I tend to like is seeing if, like, hey, if something needs to have work from, let's say, an artist and designer, can we have it just white box what's going to be from the other side of that equation, so either the artist or designer could just start working. They don't need to talk to the other person and feeling out stuff and trying how it's going to work in the actual product. Now when we do this, we're going to be pushing for often very simple tools and processes. Simplicity and flow is a huge virtue, but can we go further? We have ideally tools that can just run. What can we do about seeing if we can take it to zero? This is something I find is very important. When you're working in a game development environment, there's a lot of distractions and things folks need to pay attention to in getting things done. Getting something to zero is really about moving it outside of something people need to think about and give attention to. It's about predicting their intent. They sit down at their computer, they're wanting to accomplish X. Well, we know to accomplish X, they're going to need to have A, B, C, and D all set up for them. So let's set it up for them. Let's have it open and let's have it ready to go so that they're not having to get all that prep work done. That way, they can be free to focus on what they really creatively want to do. We can remove these unimportant details in how they're getting their development done. So we talked about the provisioning problem earlier, but we could easily take it further. Like, they're still having to, like, click and run on something. So, but there's no need for devs to ever think about it, even for them. It's just noise. So we could take it further. We could automatically run it whenever needed. I mean, we know the context of their machines, of the apps, of their certificates. We know when they're going to need something new, and so we could just do it for them. For IT, when they purchase new devices, how do we get that in for the developers? We can just have IT add it to a list and have the system go ahead and prepare it and re-update all of the portals and all of the games so it just works, and so that a developer can just grab a device from IT and get working. We could go ahead and schedule the communication with our portals automatically based on their expiration times so that we don't have to have an individual think, oh, at this date, this is going to need to be renewed or else we're going to have a problem. And as we have things that might be like, hey, we ship a product and QA still needs to test how things are working in live 6 months down the road, we could re-sign old releases and make it so that they can just pull them out. And even though they were made with a certificate that was as expired after it's been made, it just works for them. So this was a simple workflow example. We're going to dive into a non-simple example of how you can take this and approach this for a moment that we do at Machine Zone. We have a passive game readiness tool. It hooks into this system and makes sure that everyone has their provisioning and certificates ready to go. But it also hooks into a lot of other systems as well. It will retrieve the latest localization so that people who are working on the various 30 languages can go test it and they don't need to worry about that detail. It can go ahead and as people are developing and making adjustments to their art files, their design files, their Lua, and it can automatically prepare that so it's ready to run, so that we don't have to wait for, hey, I'm ready to run, go ahead and build this. We can just be building it in the background as they're going. If they have their game up and going, we can realize that they have their game up and going and say, hey, it looks like you're adjusting a UI flow and you have that UI up. Let's go ahead and send that to the game and reload it. And that way you can just see it live updating as you work. And you're not having to think about all of the process that's necessary to there. You're just working towards, hey, I'm focusing on my arts, on my design, on how the system is going to work, and I'm seeing it happen without worrying about the minutia that goes about it. So how do we get to this in our tools and processes? Well, a practical bit is to try and look at how you can think in terms of pipelining. How can you prepare your tools to compose? As we saw earlier, for the one-step release process, we had a lot of tools, and we laid them out in a pipeline so that one tool could call another, could call another, could call a bunch of things, and they could communicate. Another thing that can be gone after, which I'm a huge fan of, is really have a good control of the environment the developer is working in. If you have to worry about what software that they have, where the game is laid out, where the data might be, what they may have synced, what problems may be at their machine, all of this is friction points the tools have to deal with in order to just allow people to get to work. And so if you really look at that foundation, you're giving a much smoother thing for your tools to be built at, which in turn lets you get a much smoother process for the end users. It's important to be trying to leverage operating system events and service events. File watching is just a fantastic thing to be having integrated into your tools. And if your tools are doing anything meaningful, having them have the ability to send events over to other tools means that they can all collectively react and be intelligent. And you can build up over time saying, hey, I'm going to have a tool that reacts when this tool does something, and build up to having a more clever system. Expect, as you do this, that you're also going to get it wrong. Not all predictions you make are going to be correct, and if your routes don't include ways to turn them off, then people are going to be thinking about them all the time. And then you're not really doing them a favor of removing minutia. You're instead having them always question, is the system doing something that I don't really want it to do? But it's important to take metrics to see how many folks are turning it off. Why are they turning it off? When are they doing it? How is it actually performing for them? And learn from them so you can keep improving upon the predictions that are made, and so that your tools can get the work out of the way for them in the right way so that they're not having to think about it. So at this point, we've analyzed workflows. We've tried to reduce them down as simple as possible. In some cases, we've removed them from people's view entirely. And so what happens next? Well, at this point, we step back. We might look at that big diagram we saw earlier again and say, hey, how have we improved upon this? Is the state that we've brought things to actually better? Is there next steps that we should take on this? Sometimes we might find, hey, we've built a bunch of tools and we can now make improvements that weren't accessible before. An example is, as we talked over a build process, we could give all developers the ability to just set up a build from their desk to QA. So no matter what branch they happen to be at, they could just trigger something and go through that whole pipeline and land a build ready to iterate with QA for just checking on their feature work that they're doing. So if they're doing a complex system, they can test it without having to deal with it. So we can look for opportunities that we might drive from our simplifications. We also need to occasionally look back. Game development is constantly changing. The products that were correct 3, 5, 7 years ago may no longer be correct, may have become convoluted messes as the business kept shifting around them. So it's important to loop back around and say, okay, we built this 6 months ago, our metrics say it's performing. Is it still what the people need? Is it still making a simple process? So to summarize, this is an approach to really look and say, understand the workflow in its many steps, its many communications. Try and simplify down as small as possible in order to enable folks to just act on the intent that they really want to do. And then look at it and say, does this really help them with the creative effort of producing a game? From there, if it's not, can we remove it? If it's not answering a big, meaningful question for us, what is it? Why are people spending time on it? For anyone that has questions, feel free to come to the mic at this time.
Do I talk like this? I had one question. You mentioned something around automatically building and syncing in the background for live editing and updating. How do you manage that from a development point of view with many workflows where you're working on something you don't obviously want it to change out from underneath you? How do you manage that practically from a development point of view?
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult when folks are changing low-level systems. Just to repeat the question, it was, hey, when folks are changing things that may have lots of complexity, lots of impact, how do you manage that with a system that's just going to automatically react? Sometimes it can be what intelligence you're building into it, realizing what is subsystems, what can be hot-loaded safely. Sometimes it is really just continuing to include an off switch. Hey, the developer might know, I'm going to be working on something that reworks the whole thing, and I don't want this to do anything. The important thing is not to lose track of, hey, maybe for 95 or 99%, this is the right answer, but in the 1% case, it might not be.
Thanks.
So my question is, you said one of the things you could do is to reduce steps is predict the intent. What do you do in the inevitable case where it predicts wrong?
So in the inevitable case where it predicts wrong, again, that's where it's really important to have metrics and user studies to really get an idea of it. But also, just because you're driving things down a route where there's just, hey, I press a button and I go, doesn't mean you actually have to completely remove the ability to provide options. The real thing is not to make them mandatory, not to make it so that to go down the 90% case, you have to fill in a whole questionnaire and do things. If the answer is, hey, in this small percentage of case, I actually needed to do something totally different, if your tools have the flexibility to do that while still guiding down a simple main road, you'll get a much better result.
First of all, thanks for the great talk. You mentioned sharing templates between users. Do you have some examples of a system that would support users actually sharing that in a meaningful way?
Yes. I'm trying to figure out how I can answer that without going into too many businesses details. So the question is, do you have an example of how you can go about this? One thing I've seen in product teams do is the ability to label things that are built with certain tags. And so that when the end user is saving it, they could actually label, hey, I'm saving this and I want it as a template. And so that you can then provide when the other users are going about and saying, I want to open the design for this object. Oh, here's 5 templates that the developers have otherwise done. It makes it very easy for them to just share stuff between themselves.
Okay, great, thank you.
Have you ever had to go backwards on the simplification flow, like go from 0 to 1 step because a designer doesn't want it to happen automatically?
Yes, absolutely. And again, this is where I'm a big fan, and it's just really critical to have off switches, to have escape routes, because even as you continue to push that range from 90% correct to 95, it takes a very long time to drive it all that way. What I tend to encourage is then learn from that. See what was that really driving in the business case. And sometimes it's, hey, the tools should change, but sometimes it's also, hey, we should talk as a development team. Why is this part of our process? What is it really getting us in making our product?
Cool, thanks.
Okay.